Welcome to PayPod, the show that features thought-provoking interviews with leaders and entrepreneurs in the payments and financial technology industries. From credit card processing to Bitcoin, we cover it all. So if you want to know what's happening right now in the payments industry, stay tuned. Now, here's your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, PayPod listeners, Scott back again, and we have got another fantastic episode on tap for you today. I'm so excited for our interview today because we are going to be exploring fintech with a true expert. Chris Skinner is known as an independent commentator on the financial markets and fintech through his blog, Finanser.com, as well as an author of the best-selling books Digital Bank, ValueWeb, and its new sequel, Digital Human. In his day job, he is chair of the European Networking Forum, the Financial Services Club, chair of the Nordic Finance Innovation, as well as a non-executive director of the FinTech consultancy firm 11FS. He has been voted one of the most influential people in banking by the Financial Brand, a FinTech Titan by NextBank, and one of the top 40 most influential people in financial technology by the Wall Street Journal's Financial News, and so much more. So when I say he's an expert, I really mean it. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Scott.
How's your, the fall been going for you? We're almost there, right?
Yeah. I spend all my life flying around the world, so I never really feel I have a season because it's really wherever I've landed, you know?
Right on. Well, to start us off, can you tell us just a little bit about your career? How did you become such a well-known and respected fintech commentator and author?
Well, I was lucky enough to be made redundant in 2002. And I spent quite a long time before that working for big American technology providers such as IBM and NCR, selling and marketing and implementing and consulting around technology and financial services, covering everything during my career from insurance to retail banking to investment banking. And in 2002, as I mentioned, I was made redundant. So I started some hobbies whilst trying to get a proper job, and then discovered that my hobbies was my proper job. And my hobby is drinking with bankers and people in technology in the evenings, and then writing about the conversations about banking and technology. And I've been doing that for 16 solid years and blogging every single day for over 11 years now at Finanser.com.
Wow, that's so fantastic when a hobby can, all of a sudden you look up one day and you're like, hey, I guess this is my career now. That's incredible.
I'm quite passionate about money. I think most of us are.
Sure.
And I'm quite passionate about technology. And I'm passionate about what's happening next because that's what we don't know. And so focusing on the future of finance and technology is a great place to be.
For sure. Well, that's like a great segue to my next question, which, looking forward, can you share some of your thoughts on this digital revolution and how that will democratize wealth?
Sure. I mean, I've been moving through phases in my writing. And so Digital Bank was mainly about the challenges that banks face in dealing with digital change. ValueWeb was more around the technologies, in particular distributed ledger blockchain technology and the mobile network, and how apps and APIs were changing things. And then because of all my travels, I realized a revelation that we're right in the middle of the fourth revolution of humanity. And it's as fundamental a change as the Industrial Revolution or becoming civilized, going back 10,000 years in history. And because of that, it's in particular a change that's networking everybody on planet Earth together. We've never been in the position ever in human history that 7.5 billion people can communicate in real time with each other all the time. And that's what we have today. And some people say, oh, Chris, come on, not everyone has a mobile phone. But everyone has access to a mobile phone if they need to talk. They can borrow a friend's. And then as soon as they've got a mobile phone, they can transact and trade. And that's the fundamental revolution in changing things. And it does democratize not actually wealth, but it democratizes opportunity. So by way of example, one of the case studies I write about in Digital Human is Paytm, which is now one of the biggest mobile wallet providers in India, with over 300 million users and an ambition to have 500 million users by 2020, with full banking services available to those 500 million Indian citizens, many of whom never had access to banking because they live in rural areas. But the whole thing about Paytm is that it was started by a guy, Vijay Shankar Sharma, who just over a decade ago was homeless. And that's what I mean about democratizing opportunity, because the fact that anybody who has a vision with technology can get started very cheaply and easily, and soon through the network virally build a cascading business of change and opportunity, is something we've never had before. It's a fantastic change we're going through in this revolution of humanity.
It's incredible. And because, someone like him, maybe they wouldn't have had the opportunity to create such an amazing business and an amazing service. Now they have it. And who knows where the next great thing could come from now, because it can come from anywhere, right?
Yeah, as I say, travel a lot. And the challenge we have in America and Europe is that a lot of our infrastructure was implemented 40 or 50 years ago. And so to try and change that infrastructure is really difficult, because it's actually like the foundations of the banks. It's right there at their core. And all we've done in the past 50 years is built layers and layers upon that foundation, which means that it's cemented in place. And if you go to China, Africa, around the rest of Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, around South America to Colombia or to Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, I mean, all of these countries, which historically have been hampered in terms of opportunity because of the lack of capital, are now suddenly leapfrogging Europe and America because they hadn't implemented all this infrastructure. They're just doing it now. And that's the reason why I'm finding it so exciting, because the Southern Hemisphere specifically is showing the future of financial services all around micro-inclusion and including everybody in the network, whereas we're still dealing with how to move to chip and pin.
It's so true. It's so true. On this very show, we talk about the payments industry and specifically focus on America. And a lot of things are still very clunky. And so that just shows you such an interesting result of the fact that there are other countries that haven't historically had all of this set up and haven't had all this banking influence. And now with technology, they can just kind of race right past us because they don't have any red tape, as it were, to get through.
Yeah, I mean, I only ever get a check in the post from an American client.
Exactly.
Where we're at. And yet, if I go to China, for example, which I visit quite often now, I can't even use my credit or debit card because they don't accept contactless payments or chip and pin. They've leapfrogged straight to the mobile phone. So it's radically, fundamentally different.
Absolutely. I was really fascinated by your recent writing about the rise of QR codes as a payment system. And that's something I'd never heard of before. And frankly, I assume most of our listeners haven't either, because again, we're just talking about Americans and how different things are. Can you tell us a little bit about what a QR code payment system would look like and what it's already starting to look like where it's being implemented, maybe some of its advantages or disadvantages over a credit card or cash-based system?
Sure. I mean, the QR code payment structure is really emerging out of the Chinese giants Tencent with WeChat Pay and Ant Financial Alibaba with Alipay. And what they began doing is enabling all Chinese consumers to pay using apps with QR codes, because they didn't have much card usage in China. A lot of people didn't have access to credit and debit cards or even bank accounts until very recently. And yet now everyone's got a mobile phone. So as soon as you have a mobile phone, you can pay using a QR code. For the merchant, it makes it incredibly attractive. Firstly, because all they need is a piece of paper with a code on to take payments. They don't need any setup at all. And so literally you can find hawkers on the streets offering, roasted chestnuts, taking QR code payments. You even now have homeless people taking QR payments.
Wow.
So it's so simple. All you need is this piece of paper with a QR code on as a person taking the payment. And to make the payment, all you need is the app on your phone. And that's the reason why in China, in 2015, there was $1 trillion worth of mobile payments. In 2016, $9 trillion, and 2017, $15 trillion, and an estimate of something like $45 trillion by 2020 being transacted through QR codes on mobile phones. And you compare that to mobile payments in the US, for example. If you combine Zelle and Venmo and all the other mobile payment apps, I think America was about $150 billion last year. China was $50 trillion. So it gives you the scale of difference. And as I say, particularly in China, it's because a lot of people didn't have any other form of payment before other than cash. And now they've leapfrogged and moved to cashless because it's so simple. They've now seen exactly the same thing happening in India, in Pakistan, in Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. It's moving across all countries. And then equally for us in America and Europe, the only exposure we have to even thinking about this, maybe, particularly if we're in the payments business, is when you go to the airport and you see they accept Alipay and WeChat Pay at the airport as a QR code, because Tencent and Alibaba and Financial have been focusing specifically on enabling thousands of merchants in the US and Europe to accept QR code payments from Chinese tourists. And this then is really the point about what I was saying around this silent march of QR codes, which we dismissed and focused on contactless, maybe suddenly rearing into being the mainstream payment system of the world. Because if you have all these Chinese tourists being able to use their mobile phone apps to pay everywhere in the world, all merchants, particularly retail merchants, then why wouldn't those retail merchants, if there was a local language front end to WeChat Pay and Alipay, to take QR code payments from American consumers or European consumers? And this came up specifically because it's a very long story, but I'll cut it short. You mentioned that I chair Nordic Finance Innovation, which covers obviously all the Northern European countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. And we had a meeting in Finland, it's probably about 2 years ago now, where a local company called ePasi, which provided a QR code-based employee benefit system to Finland's companies, was talking about a story of Alibaba and Alipay and Ant Financial, which are all sort of complementary companies, coming to talk to him about being able to enable Chinese tourists to use Alipay in Lapland when they come and see Father Christmas. They signed a contract between ePasi and Alipay in June 2016, and they were live in October 2016, which the CEO of ePasi says is phenomenal speed, because 4 months is normally the time it takes him to get a meeting with the bank president, let alone getting a contract.
Sure.
And they were live in October, and 55,000 Chinese tourists came to Finland to see Father Christmas and stayed twice as long and spent 3 times as much because it was just so easy to pay with Alipay. And they estimate that something like 8 million Chinese tourists will come to see Father Christmas in 2020, which for a country with 5 million people is a little bit overwhelming. But it's a very small number of Chinese people by comparison with the 1.2 billion who live there. Now, what's interesting about the story is that the next day I had a meeting talking to the equivalent of Zelle in the Nordic region. So in Stockholm, they have a thing called Swish. In Denmark, they have a thing called Mobile Pay. In Norway, they have a mobile wallet called Vips. And in Sweden, they have a mobile wallet called Cirtul. And the 4 heads of these 4 mobile wallet structures were talking about the challenges of interoperability and the fact that a Swedish tourist, if they went to Denmark, and it's literally 60 kilometers from Malmo to Copenhagen, for example, couldn't pay using the mobile phone because they can't use their mobile phone wallet in Denmark because it's a Swedish one, and vice versa. And yet Chinese tourists can travel 6,000 kilometers from Beijing to Lapland to see Father Christmas and use the same mobile wallet. So I said to the CEO of ePasi, the next time I saw him, have you thought about putting a local language front end on the system so that everyone in the Nordic region could just use the same wallet rather than having to have 4 different ones? He said, well, that is the plan. And that to me is the plan that we'll see worldwide. We'll see an American fintech startup starting to take APIs from Alipay or WeChat Pay, bolting on the front end app that will be like Venmo, but we're using QR codes. And you can suddenly use it, all the merchants and retailers across the USA, and not only use it, but get really good offers and discounts in real time at the point of sale. And the point of sale is no longer a big, chunky, clunky, heavy system that the merchant has to pay fees for and fees on every transaction. It's just a very simple payment system using a QR code.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things where when people see the advantages in businesses and banks and all this, it becomes quite obvious, doesn't it? It's like, yes, we do need to work this way. This does need to be the plan because look at the results.
Yeah, and it's the reason why Ant Financial with Alipay became a massive case study in the book Digital Human. I mean, it's about a quarter of the book is dedicated to that company. It's not because I'm endorsing them or trying to make people sort of hear more about how wonderful they are. It's actually because they're the only company in the world still at this time that has implemented a global financial inclusion plan based on a payments platform. And that's the reason why when you mention countries like India and Pakistan, where a lot of people have had financial exclusion, they've suddenly got everybody included in the system using a really simple payments methodology. And so right now in India with Paytm, which is one of the other case studies in the book, you've got guys who are, again, street merchants who never could take a card payment. And cash was suddenly disappearing because the government said they're going to demonetize and get rid of all the cash notes. What could they do? They immediately started using Paytm. It's now the biggest mobile wallet in India.
Mm-hmm. So kind of continuing our discussion of global change here, you've stated publicly that while you think this world will move to a universal currency, you don't think it will be Bitcoin. And a central argument you posed was that the extreme fluctuations in the value of Bitcoin, which we've all seen, make it non-viable as a currency. But interestingly, you posed something as an alternative that I hadn't heard of before, a G20 coin. Can you talk about that and why you think that might be viable while Bitcoin wouldn't be?
Yeah, I mean, I actually say that Bitcoin's not viable right now because of the technological challenges of scalability and cost, as well as the fluctuation of the marketplace itself. It's not to say it never will be, but it would not be what we see as Bitcoin today. It'll be Bitcoin 7.3.
Right.
And whatever that looks like, and it may not be even Bitcoin. It could be Ethereum, it could be Ripple, or a completely different cryptocurrency that hasn't even been invented yet. But I think what will happen is we'll see a digital global currency movement eventually emerge because we have a global network and a global community and everyone included on the network that will probably be recognizing a basket of fiat currencies in a digital form, mainly because you have to have an asset-backed currency and a government-backed system to make these things work. I mean, the hardest thing for libertarians to understand in the Bitcoin community is that you cannot have money without government. They think they've invented it. And the number of times I have this discussion and say, well, governments actually invented money to have economies that could be strong or weak, depending on how well the economy and the government worked. But the financial system is the fuel of the economy for every country. And if you have a weak financial system, you have a weak country like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. And that's a reflection of government. And if you have a strong government, then they can leverage and borrow, which is what we're seeing with China and America and UK and other countries, because there's a belief in those governments and their economies and therefore their financial systems. So this is where it needs to have the G20 style basket of currencies behind whatever becomes a global currency, because it would end up being therefore something that's tied to strong economies, strong governments, strong systems, and strong structures. And it doesn't mean that the government has to govern the community. It means actually that you've got this global platform with a global currency, but the global currency reflects back into control structures that are trusted by citizens and that actually have some form of backing where if the system starts to collapse, it can be rescued. When the Bitcoin system collapses, the people who had invested aren't rescued, they just lose their money. If
right.
on Bitcoin, you've got no ability to get the money back. There's no federal insurance scheme, you're stuffed. So that's what I'm really getting at. There has to be something behind the system, particularly in a global currency, that can make it stable, secure, and trusted.
For sure. Now, sticking with the conversation on Bitcoin, I saw a recent piece on your site, which was entitled When National Currencies Fail. And it talked about how in countries facing rampant inflation, cryptocurrencies actually do have some legs. And that piece got me thinking, especially your discussion here about, the government backed. I'm wondering if you could envision a world in which the populations of countries rocked by inflation just adopt cryptocurrency to such a degree that it would become the de facto currency of that nation. And if that isn't the situation in which a cryptocurrency could get the big push to go mainstream from a government.
It can happen, and I've seen it happen several times already, particularly when we had the sovereign debt crisis in Europe and a lot of European citizens started putting money into crypto. We've seen the same with Venezuela, which is in particular the country that I picked on in that discussion, because the Venezuelan bolivar escalated to a point where a roll of toilet paper would cost you 2.6 million bolivars, which is actually a lot in old money, but it's just valueless. And so Venezuelans have been putting money into crypto. The problem with it is that whilst crypto is so volatile and the community is still so small, and equally, if you can't actually cash in and cash out easily, if you can't use it to pay easily, it's obviously flawed and it's not going to work. So more of what's happening in crazy basket economies where things just aren't working anymore is that people put crypto investments just really to have somewhere to store their money and keep its value.
I see.
And eventually things will emerge. And I think when I say eventually, I'm probably talking about another 10 to 15 years. It's not going to be overnight. But we'll see this global digital currency backed by a basket of strong economy, government currencies, trading easily around the world using whatever QR code looks like by 2030, I have no idea, in a very simple structure. Equally, if you look that far out, then you start to get into some other interesting discussions around universal basic income and what will currency and money mean at the point where there's no poverty on planet Earth, for example. That takes us into another much more speculative debate. But right now, I think what's emerging is that, yes, cryptocurrencies are doing something really interesting, and one or several of them may eventually take off. At the moment, there's too many. There's over 1,000 out there. And many of them are pure speculative or even scams. So we need to get to a point where something is actually stable, secure, but endorsed by governments and works. And then you have money with government rather than money without government.
Do you think that paper money will eventually just become completely obsolete? And if so, do you think that this will happen in our lifetime?
Well, in some countries, paper money is obsolete. I mean, in China's the biggest cities, the tier one cities, and by tier one, we're talking cities with 20 plus million people, already completely cashless. Chinese citizens do not take cash out with them anymore. They just take their phone. And if you're a tourist in China, then the only form of payment you'll be able to make is with cash, if you can find a cash machine that's actually on the global network, because most of the domestic Chinese banks don't link to the international networks. So that's an interesting debate. There's several other countries that are driving for being cashless as quickly as they can. So a lot of the Nordic countries laugh at you if you produce cash because they just don't need it anymore. Turkey, which at the moment is going through massive problems governmentally, which is why their currency is also going through the floor. But Turkey's actively been trying to move towards being cashless for the past 5-10 years. But countries move at different speeds, so it has to be a motivation to do it, which is why I don't think you'll see the US or many European countries cashless for a long time to come, because at the moment it's a perfectly viable, good system, and they don't necessarily drive consumers away from it. The problem with cash, however, is that it's the favorite currency for laundering. And if you can get rid of crime and money laundering and people doing nasty things, then get rid of cash.
Absolutely. With the financial world changing so much, cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, all these things that we're talking about here, what do you think governments need to do in order to help provide legal frameworks and roadmaps that protect consumers and our very financial systems? How should they approach legislation to not stifle innovation or halt progress, but also keep things under control? Maybe, some of the things we've seen with Bitcoin and reining in some of that and scams and all that stuff.
Well, there's a balance between regulation and innovation. And I think the balance is making sure that there isn't a rapid movement towards an unregulated marketplace, and communicating that if you do make a movement into an unregulated marketplace, then you might get into trouble. That's the reason why people who remortgaged or to put money into crypto last year in December are now losing their homes. It's as plain as that. I know I just came back from China, and China again has a massive peer-to-peer lending marketplace with billions of dollars transacted every month. But those billions of dollars are funded by people's savings. And most of these peer-to-peer lenders in China, there's over 3,000 of them, are going bankrupt right now because the regulation finally came in saying you cannot actually give loans to consumers in China as a peer-to-peer lender without having a securitized marketplace. And it's caused a lot of them to shut down. People are losing their life savings. So I think government's responsibility is to try and maintain a regulatory structure that's fluid and adaptive and can keep up with market change. And that's where we're starting to see that happen. In particular, as you can tell by my accent, I'm British. I don't actually spend much time in Britain anymore, but one of the things about the UK regulator is they have moved pretty quickly to try and create an innovation regulation model. So the innovation regulation model says, if you're doing something that's interesting in an innovative space, come and play with us. We'll mentor you. We'll give you access to our people. We'll help you get to the markets. We'll help you work with the banks in partnership. where it's appropriate. We'll see if what you're doing is viable and actually is something that we believe can work, or if it's something that we don't believe can work. We'll explain why. And you really need to get regulated before you can succeed. That's the bottom line. And what's been interesting in my time looking at fintech, for example, is that a lot of the fintech startups believed that maybe they didn't need to be governed, they didn't need to be regulated, they could destroy the banks. And it's amazing how quickly they mature and find out, actually, it's pretty good to be regulated. It's pretty good to work with the banks. There's a reason why they exist this way. We haven't had 300 years of financial market development because we're stupid and just do it this way because we're idiots. We do it for a reason. And a lot of it's to do with consumer protection and economic protection. So as the startups maybe start naively as they learn this, then it gets to be a much more interesting marketplace. And right now, for example, I talk a lot about a few years ago, all the charts in Crunchbase and Business Insider and TechCrunch were all about the unbundling of the bank. And now, guess what? We've got the banks doing the rebundling of the fintech.
How apropos to observe that, and that just shows you, it really emphasizes your point. Absolutely.
Well, it's because you can't work with 1,000 companies that you don't have any idea who they are, what their pedigree is, who's running them, whether they're regulated or not. As a consumer, these companies in particular, they're often new, they don't have any trust, they don't have any history, they don't have any capital in many instances, and they don't have many customers. So how to build that trust has to come from a trusted entity. And the reason why we trust banks is not because we like their brands or their people. We don't trust them as far as we can throw them. Look at the financial crisis. But having said that, we trust them with our money because we know that they're good for the money because they're backed by government and have an insurance scheme. That's the only reason why we trust banks with our money.
Absolutely. So we like to end with a segment that we call our Fast 5 questions, rapid fire. Chris, are you ready?
Sure.
Make a prediction about the future of fintech that you expect will happen in the next 12 to 24 months.
In the next 12 to 24 months, I'm pretty sure we're going to see some of the fintech unicorns starting to partner together to build global platforms.
What's one cool piece of payment or transaction-related technology that you've come across recently that really impressed you, that particularly impressed you?
We've talked about quite a few of them.
Right, yeah.
I guess the ones I like the most are coming around from Asian markets.
Mm-hmm.
And equally, the biometrics are interesting these days in terms of, if you're familiar with Apple Pay, you'll know that you just pay with your thumbprint. A lot more of that's going to start to come through. And maybe the coolest thing I've seen, it's not hugely successful, but I've talked for over a decade about putting chips inside our children to track where they are and what they're doing. And then they could pay for things using the chip inside them. Sweden's actually rolled out that program. So if you go to Sweden, Stockholm, not many people, but some people have chips inside their hands that pays for the subway networks.
Oh my gosh. That is really cool. Just imagine a child going and buying a pack of gum at the corner store with a chip in there.
It's based on NFC chip inside technologies.
In the next 5 years, most Americans will make a purchase with Bitcoin, Apple Pay, or some other thing. Which one do you think and why?
Some other thing called cash.
So still cash is king in America in 5 years, you think?
Cash and card. At Money 2020, which is a big trade show that probably you're familiar with, and most people are if they're in this space, they have a payments race to see if you send 5 people out with gold, cryptocurrency, cards, cash, then they have some other ideas, depending on which region you're in, who will get there first. And it's nearly always the cash and card guys who get to the US one first. In Europe and Asia, it tends to be the mobile payments guys.
What's one piece of advice you would have for someone who's considering the fintech industry as a career?
Don't have any constraints. These days, you can start something in the financial world by specializing on one idea, doing one thing, and rolling it out through cloud-based platforms and marketplaces really quickly and getting a virality that can grow a brand new unicorn. I mean, my favorite unicorn I talk about all the time is Stripe, which is the online checkout API developed by John and Patrick Collinson. And the reason I talk about it all the time is that it was developed by John and Patrick when they were 19 and 21 years old. So teenagers can reinvent the future of banking and finance. B is doing one thing to begin with, which is online checkout using 7 lines of code. So it's really simple and easy plug and play technology. And C, The company's now valued at around $30 billion after 6 years of operation. The last proper valuation was in 2016 at $9.2 billion. I think they've tripled in values in the 18 months, 2 years since then. So, if you take that story, you've got a teenager who's become one of the youngest billionaires in the world. Wouldn't you want to be in that career?
For sure. Last one. What's the best business advice you've ever received, and from whom?
Well, the best business advice that I give, because I wish I'd received it when it happened, is when I was made redundant, turn all of your suppliers into customers. Because all the people who used to be people I brought things from when I was in my proper job became the people who used me as a consultant when I lost the job. So that would have been useful to consciously know rather than to discover through trial and error myself. But my favorite quote is from Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is, "Don't quote at me. Tell me what you think."
I love it. Chris, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me on the show today. This was just so fascinating and informative.
It's been a pleasure, Scott. And as you know, I'm always writing. So if anyone wants to find out what I'm thinking next or doing next, follow me at thefinanser.com.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic site and so many great articles to read there. And also do check out Chris's books. He's got several, and especially Digital Human, which is the new sequel. So that's it for our interview today, which means that it is time to award our Small Business Organization of the Week. Each and every episode, we want to highlight business groups and organizations doing great work advancing the interests of entrepreneurs and small businesses, helping business people connect, being positive influences in their local communities, and so much more. These organizations are nominated by you, our listeners. So if you ever think of one you think deserves to be highlighted, don't hesitate to let us know. Send an email to scott@soarpay.com and we may just mention it. This week, though, we're happy to award America's SBDC. America's SBDC represents America's nationwide network of small business development centers, or SBDCs, the most comprehensive small business assistant network in the United States and its territories. SBDCs are hosted by leading universities, colleges, state economic development agencies, and private partners, and funded in part by the United States Congress through a partnership with the U.S. Small Business Administration. There are nearly 1,000 local centers available to provide no-cost business consulting and low-cost training to new and existing businesses. Small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs can go to their local SBDCs for free face-to-face business consulting and at-cost training on a variety of topics. You can learn more about them by visiting them online at americassbdc.org. Many congrats to them on their selection. Well, that's it for our show today. Thank you so much for listening. And if you like what we do here, don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or whatever your preferred podcast listening platform is. We'll be back with another episode very soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of PayPod, brought to you by Soar Payments. Soar Payments is a leading merchant services provider for e-commerce, high-risk, and hard-to-place businesses. If you'd like to get the latest PayPod episodes sent to you automatically, subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher, or visit soarpay.com/podcast.